rolling here with this PowerPoint, I want to kind of bridge the conversation between what we've been speaking about, which is the central nervous system and the anatomy of the central nervous system. We talked about brain and spinal cord, and then we talked about the peripheral nervous system, which was kind of everything else. So we're picking up with that idea. We're picking up from that conversation, and we're looking specifically at the everything else, right? The peripheral nervous system. And this is where we find the two branches of the peripheral nervous system. It's the autonomic nervous system and then the somatic nervous system. And we'll talk about the somatic nervous system in our next packet. And so we're kind of zoning in on the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, now when we think about the autonomic nervous system, there's a further division here. There's the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and there's the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to spend today talking about the branches of the autonomic nervous system, talking about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, and the functions of the autonomic nervous system. So kind of a backstory here, the autonomic nervous system is really the secretive part of the nervous system. It's the involuntary branch. This is not controlled by us voluntarily. This is pretty much everything else that's happening in the background. The regulation of blood pressure, the regulation of heart rate, heart rhythm, the regulation of gastric motility, gastric secretions, glandular secretions, so salivary glands, your lacrimal glands, the regulation of the sexual response and the reproductive function. So all of the things that are happening in the background that we don't consciously know about or think about, but they're just somehow being managed and controlled and regulated. This is what the autonomic nervous system governs or is about. And so we've got this two-division system here with the autonomic nervous system. There's the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. And an easy way to think about these two divisions is to think about two different scenarios here. So when we think about the sympathetic nervous system, for example, here we're thinking about functions of the fight or flight response, escaping from a threat, fleeing from danger. So this is where your skeletal muscles are going to be activated. Blood is going to be shunting towards your skeletal muscle and away from things like your GI organs, right? Because if you're in danger, digestion is not high on the priority list. This is where you're going to have opening up of the pupils so that more light can enter the eyes so that you can appropriately assess your environment. This is where you're going to have a decrease in, again, glandular secretions, but an increase in sweat gland secretion so that you can, again, cool off the body, increase your skeletal muscle activity, increase your mobility, and escape a threat. So that's the fight or flight response, sometimes called the fight or flight or freeze, because sometimes in danger, the body responds by just freezing and staying in one spot as well. The other division is the parasympathetic division of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. And this is kind of the opposite end of that first scenario. So here we're thinking about, let's say Thanksgiving, like Thanksgiving's coming up in a couple of weeks, you're relaxing on the couch, you just had a really large meal, your skeletal muscles are not, receiving a lot of blood supply, your GI organs are, your liver is, right? It's getting all of that blood coming into it. It's secreting bile to help break down that meal. Your pupils are more constricted because you're not trying to assess your environment as much. And so this is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is the rest and digest division of the autonomic nervous system. And so it's really important to be keeping those two functional aspects of these branches of the nervous system separate, but also thinking about how they're really controlling the exact same organs. When I'm resting and digesting, there's still influence on my heart rate. It's just the influence here is just to slow it down. When I'm fleeing from a threat, again, there's still influence on my heart rate, but the influence is going to be to speed up heart rate. So we have this idea of comparative secrecy where although it's two different divisions and two different types of function, it's really the same glands, the same organs that are being controlled, but it's two different divisions that are having different influences on the exact same glands and organs. Okay, so this controls many, many unconscious processes important for homeostasis. Again, things like blood pressure, heart rate, heart rhythm, etc. And homeostasis cannot be brought about or maintained without the autonomic nervous system. All right, so kind of a mouthful there, but really just setting the tone, setting the backdrop for really understanding this branch of the nervous system and the functional aspect between the two divisions here. Right. So here is a really nice schematic image. It's showing us the two divisions that I spoke about and focusing more here on the anatomy of those two divisions. So what we can see on the left is the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. And we can appreciate that the fibers that govern the sympathetic branch arise from different areas of the brain and spinal cord than the fibers that govern the parasympathetic branch on the right. But we can also appreciate that the glands, the organs, the structures that are being innervated are the exact same, but they're just receiving, they're just receiving dual innervation from both of these branches. So for example, we've got the liver, pancreas, spleen, the lungs, heart, and they're receiving influence from both of those divisions. And that's kind of what keeps the body in homeostasis. This is where homeostasis comes into play. When I'm sitting here resting, just speaking in my normal indoor voice, normal respiration here, I'm having influence from my sympathetic system on my heart, lungs, GI, but I'm also having influence from my parasympathetic system. And this is what keeps me in this state of balance. If I were to lose my sympathetic division, the parasympathetic would take over and things would slow down way too much. If I were to lose my sympathetic input, if I were to lose my parasympathetic input, my sympathetic would take over. And again, things would speed up way too much. So what's keeping me in this state of homeostasis, in this state of balance, is the equal, not equal, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's not exactly equal. It's slightly more parasympathetic influence, but it's the shared influence of both of these divisions of the nervous system. Alrighty. And so when we look at the anatomic location of the fibers of the sympathetic system, they come from the thoracolumbar segment of the spinal cord. So the spinal segments T1 to L2 here, whereas the parasympathetic fibers arise from two completely different areas of the spinal cord. Of the spinal cord and brain. It's coming from the brainstem, which are the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, as well as the sacral region of the spinal cord, S2, S3, S4. So the fibers that govern these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system arise from completely different locations. The length of the neurons are also different, and the association with the ganglia are also different. I'll talk about what those aspects mean here in a bit. Okay, so let's think about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system here. Let's kind of illustrate that a bit. Oops. Okay, so we're thinking about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. Oh no. I'm sorry guys, my Zoom just closed. Hang on here. What happened? Oh, I don't know what happened guys, but I'm gonna share my screen again. Oops. Okay. Okay, so we're kind of illustrating the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system and the neurons that are involved, okay? So we've got the region of the spinal cord or brain stem. So we're thinking about, it's really important to be thinking about the options that are possible here. So when you think about the autonomic nervous system, based upon the image that we just talked about, remember that this can be two different locations. It could be spinal cord. If it's sympathetic, it can be brain stem if it's not, okay? So let's think about the cross-section here of the region of the brain stem or spinal cord where the fibers are arising from. And so if you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we've got 3 different horns associated with the spinal cord. Okay. All right. So we've got the lateral horn. This is where the fibers arise from. This is called the lateral horn. Let's write that somewhere else. So here's our lateral horn. Here's our dorsal horn. This is going to be associated with sensory information. We'll talk more about this a bit later on. And then we also have the ventral horn, okay? Right? And so the fibers of the autonomic nervous system arise specifically from the lateral horn. Really important, okay? We'll talk about the somatic nervous system, which arises from the ventral horn. And so you really want to make that distinction here, very important distinction to make. Fibers of the autonomic nervous system arise from the lateral horn of the spinal cord. They travel out, they synapse at a ganglia. And I'll talk about what a ganglia is here in a bit. And then the second neuron, so the postganglionic neuron, synapses onto the effector tissue. And so the effector tissue can be a couple of different things here. We're talking about the autonomic nervous system. So this is not tissue or glands that we voluntarily control. This is example, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. We've got an abundance of smooth muscle throughout the body. Blood vessels are lined with smooth muscle, the GI tract, reproductive tract. The heart has a little bit of smooth muscle around the vascular components there. The lungs have smooth muscle, the bronchioles. So smooth muscle pretty much abundantly throughout the body. Glands throughout the body, excepting sweat glands. And I'll talk on why sweat glands kind of differ here, but glands for the most part, and then adipose tissue. Okay. And so we can label these two neurons the way we've been doing as a preganglionic neuron, respectively. And then we can think about a postganglionic neuron, which is the second neuron beyond the ganglia. Okay. Now let's kind of define a ganglia. A ganglia is a collection of cell bodies or soma that is not in the central nervous system. So it's important for us to make this distinction here, right? We've got this leaving of these fibers from central nervous system, which is here, to peripheral nervous system, which is everything out here, okay? But anytime we have somas or cell bodies that are not in the central nervous system, we call this a ganglia. And because this is specifically communicating with the autonomic fibers, the autonomic nervous system, we can refer to this as an autonomic ganglia. Okay. So we've got a preganglionic neuron, we've got a postganglionic neuron, and then it finally synapses onto some type of effector tissue. And again, we want to associate the effector tissue here with all those organs that we saw in the middle of that schematic diagram on the previous slide, okay, as some examples. We also want to talk a little bit about the length of these neurons, and that's going to differ depending on which division we're looking at. So we want to think about the preganglionic neuron as being a shorter neuron in the sympathetic system. So in the sympathetic system, the preganglionic neuron is short, and in the parasympathetic system, the parasympathetic system, the preganglionic neuron is long, okay? In the sympathetic system, the postganglionic neuron is long. Oops. Yeah, so in the sympathetic system, we've got a long postganglionic neuron, whereas in the parasympathetic system, we've got a shorter postganglionic neuron, okay? And so we can see how the anatomy is going to differ here, right? In the parasympathetic system, we've got a longer preganglionic neuron. So this neuron stretches all the way out very close to the effector tissue that it's going to innervate. And so the ganglia is going to be really close to the effector tissue because the preganglionic neuron is long and the postganglionic neuron is short. In the sympathetic system, we see the opposite. There's a really short preganglionic neuron, and there's a really long postganglionic neuron. And so the ganglia is physically much closer to the spinal cord where those fibers are arising from, and much farther away from the effector tissue that ultimately is innervated, okay? Right. I also want to make a note here, again, because we're going to talk about this and I want it to be clear later on, that the autonomic ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system, so in the sympathetic nervous system, these autonomic ganglia become the sympathetic chain. Okay, so it's a physical structure. The collection of these ganglia, it's located right next to the spinal cord, again, indicating the length of the preganglionic neuron, really short length there. And so these structures collectively are called the sympathetic chain. Okay, so the autonomic ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system create or form the sympathetic chain. Again, another important distinction we want to make, there's not a sympathetic chain or a chain of any sort associated with the parasympathetic system.